Hello, and welcome back to our four-part series on emblem and logo creation in Blender. This is part 4 of the series. In part 3, we covered advanced modeling, which was mesh manipulation using modifiers. And in this part, we're going to wrap up the whole thing by covering UV mapping and material creation in cycles. This is where we'll actually start to apply some textures and material to our model and render it as a nice, pretty 3D object. Okay. Now, first of all, I used a word there that we haven't used this whole time called cycles. Render material creation in cycles. What is cycles? Well, Blender, being an open source piece of software, has multiple engines that are a part of it. And the engine is basically just the way that the software kind of interprets 3D objects and renders them. So this whole time, at the top here, we've been on Blender Render, which is it's kind of commonly referred to as the internal render engine. The internal Blender render engine, if we want to see what it looks like, we can come down here and we can change our view from solid to rendered, and we get this thing that it's pure black. It's pure black because we don't have any light sources in our scene here. So actually, we can keep the cursor where it is, and we'll just create a point light source. All right, now we'll switch back to rendered mode. Now we've got this. Okay, this is 3D. There's some basic shadows going on here, and this is our 3D object. But let's be perfectly honest, this doesn't look good. Okay, from an artistic standpoint, this doesn't look good. Okay. The reason it doesn't look good, just as a general overview, is because the Blender internal render engine uses simple lighting. Simple lighting means it kind of just comes up with a gradient for shadows, and it makes hard, sharp shadows. You can see that on these these surfaces that are perpendicular to our light source, they're just pure jet black, and that's not realistic, right? Well, the reason why the internal render engine exists is because a lot of times you don't need realistic lighting, and to be perfectly honest, realistic lighting is very taxing on your computer. It's hard to calculate because the light bounces. But we can still do it, and we are going to do it because global lighting is the term that usually means realistic lighting. Global lighting, it bounces and reflects realistically. Global lighting is supported by Blender, but not the internal render engine, but the cycles render engine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to this top here and just change the render engine to cycles. Now, nothing's changed here. It may look that way, but if we go to render now, we will see something very different. This looks very, very different, does it not? This looks pretty good, in fact. It's kind of like a clay rendering. Now, you notice my computer's kind of struggling. It's got this like static here. So I'm going to solve that by going over to our device here and switching to GPU compute. Now, you may not have a GPU in your computer. If you don't, that's fine. Your CPU will handle it. But just be aware that CPUs are not optimized for graphics. And so generally speaking, if you use your CPU as your render engine, it will be slower and just less fun. Now, I have an old GTX 720, 750. I can't remember which one it is, but it's an older graphics card, about 2 or 3 years old, and but it does pretty good. Now the static is just it's kind of inherent to cycles. The way that cycles works is it kind of starts very rough and kind of does more samples over and over and over again until it resolves a very clear image. And so when we do the viewport render like this, it's only going to do 32 samples. You can see up here, that is something you can change if you want to, but we'll keep it at 32. So the image looks pretty staticky, but rest assured, when you do the final render and you crank up the sample rate, that static will go away. Anyway, this is just what our object looks like in cycles with global lighting. You can see it's got nice soft shadows, and it honestly looks really good just like this. But we want to apply some materials to this. We want to make this look kind of like a real thing, maybe like it's made out of metal or something, right? So let's go back to the object mode. And let's talk about materials, okay? the way cycles, like I'm sure a lot of you are aware of what texturing is, because texturing is talked about a lot in video games, but cycles goes one step further with textures and actually uses materials. We can edit the materials of an object by selecting it and then going over to our properties tab and clicking on the materials tab. Now right now you can see that there are no materials that have been created yet. So what we'll do is we'll create a new one. Now, just right here, we have very basic controls on what type of surface we want. By default, we have a diffuse surface. So if we go back to render mode, and just so you're aware, the Shift-Z is a hotkey I custom set up to switch to render mode, so if you want to make that, you'll have to do it yourself. I just set it up for ease of switching back and forth. Anyway, diffuse looks like this, but we can switch this between some presets right here. Let's change it to glossy. Now glossy is right now it's set on 100% perfect gloss, so it's actually just like a mirror, right? And you can see the sword is reflected here. Looks kind of cool in its own right? Let's kind of take a look at some other kind of interesting stuff we can do. We can do emission. Emission is basically light source. So now it's just pure white because it's giving off light. Velvet. I've actually never really used velvet before. It's kind of interesting. Not really sure how to describe what that is. I guess it's a surface that kind of simulates like a hair kind of texture, because when you look at it point blank, it looks darker. Interesting. Anyway, glass will be transparent. So if we look at it from the bottom, we can see the underside of our little emblem. All sorts of good stuff. And this actually is performing quite well because we've made a very basic scene here, which is nice. It's a good way to illustrate. So let's just switch it back to diffuse. Now, let's get a little complicated with this, all right? Remember in video 1 how I told you you can you create multiple windows in Blender by dragging? So let's do that. Let's make a second window over here. Now, for whatever reason, I've always had the preference of doing my granular work on the left. So let's switch the left view over to the node editor. Now, what are nodes? Nodes are kind of like a graphical interface for programming, sort of. What I mean by that is that we can actually change the properties of these Blender materials by creating a set of nodes that are linked together in a certain specific way that will then change the surface properties according to that layout. And nodes can be, at their very most basic, you have this, which is just one diffuse node connected to the surface output, and that ends up creating this basic diffuse surface. But we can chain these together and mix them and modify them in all sorts of very unique and crazy ways to make super unique surfaces and super specific surfaces. So, for example, I'm going to add a new node, a shader node, and let's make it a glossy node. All right, and then I will add a mix shader, and I will mix these two together. And now what we have is a diffuse surface and a glossy surface. If we went all the way glossy, we end up with that that almost perfect mirror, right? Right there. But if we mix in some diffuse, we can make a surface that kind of just looks like a really shiny kind of white enamel, right? And that looks pretty good just by itself. And you can see that both of these have properties inherent to them. I can increase the roughness of the glossy just on its own. And I can increase the roughness of the diffuse just on its own. All right? So we can use these nodes to add texture as well, because texture is its own node. In fact, there's many, many different kinds of nodes. So we'll say Shift-A. Shift-A, which, by the way, is the hotkey for adding a node. So when you hit Shift-A, you end up with this little menu here. And these are all different kinds of nodes. So we want to do a texture, and we want to do an image texture. Okay? Now, let's say we want to make this metal. Okay? We can do open, and I'll go through my collection of textures here. and we want metal 09. And we've got different files here. I'll talk about that in a second, but for now we'll just do metal 09 color. And for your reference, metal 09 color texture looks like this. Okay? Now, as a quick side, if you're looking for textures, I recommend a website called cc0textures.com. They have really good textures, really good high quality textures and high resolution. And they also have the multiple images that I'm about to describe to you in a second. But for right now, we're just sticking with color. I'll get to the other kind of images in a second. So what we can do here is I've made this image texture refer to that metal texture that I picked out, and I can drag the color little dot and connect it to the diffuse dot. Now you see that this just turned kind of gray. Okay, but maybe the glossy is having an effect here. So let's take out these guys. Let's just connect the diffuse straight to the surface. Now we've got some kind of gray thing going on here. Why is that? Well, if we preview the surface here, it's just like this gray color, and it's the material, the metal is really not coming across. The reason it's not coming across is because this object has no UV information associated with it yet. What is UV information? What is UV wrapping? UV wrapping might be a term you're familiar with, again, if you're really heavy into video games and things like that. UV wrapping is basically the way that a 3D program applies a 2D image to a 3D surface, okay? What that means, and the reason the word wrap is appropriately used, is because you're basically just like wrapping a Christmas present. You're just putting that 2D surface and wrapping it around that 3D surface. The reason you have to manually kind of create a UV map is because this 3D software doesn't just magically know how that wrap needs to happen. And it has tools that can kind of figure it out, but even in specific circumstances, you need to specifically say, this is how I want this to be wrapped. So let's unwrap the UVs of this backing plate right here. Let's go back to our object mode. Let's hit Tab. Let's hit A to select all. And then let's hit U for UV mapping. Now there are two options up here at the top: Unwrap and Smart UV Project. Now Unwrap is pretty good at it. Unwrap will just straight up unwrap the object and create a UV map from scratch. However, Smart UV Project will do that same process, but a little bit more intelligently, and I should say significantly more intelligently, and it'll give you some options to tweak to make it even better if you want to. I almost exclusively use Smart UV Project, and the only time I use Unwrap is when I have to manually create creases and then unwrap in a specific way, only because Smart UV Project failed. So let's hit Smart UV Project. Let's leave these alone, hit OK. Now, nothing happened, right? Well, we have created a UV map. We just haven't seen it yet. So let's switch our little node section here to the UV image editor. And now here we go. This is what this object looks like unwrapped on the sheet. And so what'll happen is the 2D object will get overlaid on this, and then whatever the result is in these little squares gets applied to the 3D surface. So right now you can see the background is nothing, but if we wanted a reference, we could go back and select our metal and see this. So now we know, just by looking at this UV map with the image overlaid in the background, that the grain of this metal is going to be going side to side here. So now if I go back into our main viewport and hit Tab, and then I switch to Material View, now you can see that brushed metal is going that way. Let's take a look at what this looks like in rendered mode. Not bad, right? So now it looks kind of like a piece of metal, but it also looks pretty flat, right? We can fix that, and we can fix that by using normal maps. Now, what's a normal map? A normal map is basically a way for a 3D modeling software to fake material depth, okay? So instead of having actual geometry that follows the grains of this metal, because that would be insane, right? You'd have to have so many vertices to do every one of these little like divots and bumps and ridge. It would be impossible. So what the software can do is it can use a certain image, a specially prepared image, to fake those kinds of shadows on the surface. So we're going to do that by switching back over to our node editor, and we're going to add another image texture, right? And this time, instead of adding the Metal 09 color, we're going to add the Metal 09 displacement. So now I need to make a clarification here. Okay? I said normal map earlier. Most programs use what's called a normal map. In Cycles, it prefers to use a displacement map. Now, can you use a normal map from another program as a displacement map? Absolutely. It doesn't really matter. But I'm just trying to use the terminology that is in front of you here in Blender. So for Cycles, what we're trying to accomplish here is getting displacement, okay? But if you want to look up tutorials online, just be aware normal mapping is kind of the same thing and will get you in the right track as well. So let's just connect this displacement map right to the displacement tab here on the output. Now, let's switch back to our render and see what we got. Well, it looks really dark, right? Why does it look so dark? Well, it looks really dark because what Blender is doing now with that displacement map is it's creating like really hard depth on there. And so that's made the surface look a lot blacker. Now, why is it doing that? Well, the displacement map, first of all, it is this. This image is the displacement map. You'll notice something important about it. It's very similar to the color map, except this is in black and white. There's a reason for that. When you use displacement in Cycles, the displacement node only cares about black and white. White surfaces will be higher, quote, higher, and black surfaces will be, quote, lower, okay? So since this is a black and white image, it's taking an extreme height difference between the white and the black. So what I do to kind of fix that, to make the depth not so much, is I add a node in between the image texture, the displacement texture, and the actual displacement output. And what I add is a contrast node, okay? So if I pop that in between there, I can now change the contrast that's being put into the output. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it very small. I'm going to make it negative 0.95. I'm going to turn my num lock off so I can actually do that. Okay? And by doing negative 0.95, I've drastically decreased the contrast there, which means that the depth goes down, but I still maintain some degree of depth, which means when I move that lamp around, let's see if I can select that lamp, and then G. When I move that lamp around, you get shadows and lighting on the depth of the material in a realistic way. You can see as I do this that the material is getting lit as if it had depth, like a sheet of brushed metal. Okay? So that's the effect we want. But I personally don't like the way that this grain is going. How do we fix that? Okay? Let's select it again, hit tab, go back into the UV editor, and now we can select things here and actually rotate them to change the way that the texture is wrapped around. So let's switch this view to like the face view here, and we'll select these guys, and then we can rotate 90 degrees, and now the grain is going the way that I would like it to go. However, this guy, for whatever reason, is kind of, you see this guy is like perfectly, he's like perfectly flat, but this guy up here, he kind of isn't for some reason. I don't really know why. So let's just rotate him manually. Oops, we're on the wrong screen there. to rotate him manually. Something like that. That's close enough. Now, what if you don't like the size of the grains? Well, you can fix that by scaling this image up and down. See, if I scale it like that, I can make the grains a lot smaller. If I scale it down, I can make them a lot bigger. So since, you know, we're trying to go for like kind of like a smallish kind of emblem, let's make the grains somewhat big. Let's make them something like that. Okay. I'll go back to our up view. Now you see we still got some weirdness going on here. So let's rotate this until it looks roughly vertical. Something like that. All right. Shift Z. There we go. It looks pretty good. Now let's apply what we just did to some of the other objects here, like our swords. Let's create a new material. Let's go into the node editor. Let's just make this solid gold. Let's not apply any texture to this. That would make it a little too complicated, right? Let's just make this shiny gold. Shift A, shader, glossy. Shift A, shader, mix shader. Mix these two guys together. Shift A, input, RGB. Okay? And we attach the RGB to both of these guys. And then let's make this guy like some kind of yellow. Now we can see, it's kind of hard to see in the material view, but we can see in the preview view kind of like what it's going to look like. So we actually want to crank up the glossy a little bit, make it real shiny. Even shinier, in fact. Make it real gold, right? And the hard part about making a gold color is that it always ends up coming out too yellow, right? So let's just try to mess around here and find a good gold color. Let's say something like that. That doesn't look too bad. Now, as we'll call this, we'll name this material gold. So when we go over here to the other sword, we can make this gold as well. Shift Z. And it looks pretty good. It's not bad. But you know what? Let's decide at the last minute. Maybe we want to add some depth here. So what we can do, just very quickly off the bat, is we can unwrap this sword, just like we did before. Right? And then let's take a quick look at what that UV map looks like. That looks pretty good, nice and straight. There is probably going to be some errors with this stuff. You can see the sword blade has kind of been squished down. So we can just manually fix that a little bit by doing this. Those are probably a lot closer to the correct proportions. And then we'll go back to the node editor. And now let's add some displacement to this. Let's get some texture going, right? But this time, what we're going to do is we're not going to use an image texture. We're just going to keep this gold RGB as the input for the color, right? We're not going to change the colors. We're just going to change the displacement. And we're going to use the same displacement as before. And then, just like before, we're also going to put in a brightness and contrast node. Link those together, get some displacement going on, and then we will lower this drastically again, 0.95, something like that. Now you can see the grain is going the exact wrong way, so we should have just rotated 90 degrees. So, rotate 90. Oop, screwed that up. Rotate 90. That's not looking too bad. So let's go to our rendered view. Now we're having that same problem where the cuts are really deep again. So I thought I fixed that, but let's check. Contrast negative 0.95. It also probably, so another way to make this look a little bit better would be to make the actual texture smaller. We can do that by increasing the scale of it by a lot. Something like that. In fact, what we need to be doing is applying that to everything. Scale up. Like that. Then we'll get back to the node editor. So let's see, negative 0.99. There we go. That's closer. Still get a little bit of texture, but not anything that kind of ruins that really pretty finish. So let's actually make that even smaller, even less of a contrast. Oh. I keep forgetting the negative sign. That's what's causing the problem. Negative 0.995. There we go. That looks pretty good. All right. Now, instead of doing everything we just did to the second sword, I'm just gonna duplicate that guy and real quickly do what we did in the beginning. There we go. So now that we've got that, Shift Z. All right, now I've got two little gold swords on there with a nice little texture. Let's do the same thing to the chains. Create a new material. Let's make the chains something interesting, right? Let's make the chains perfect silver, like a kind of like a real shiny surface. So Shift A, shader, glossy, Shift A, shader, mix shader, add them together, input, RGB, add these guys, make it like a gray, turn down the roughness, turn down the glossy, maybe turn up white a little bit. All right. There we go. That looks pretty good, I would say. Got some gold, got some silver, got some brush steel in the back. In fact, I want to make a little bit more contrast with the brush steel. So what we can do is kind of turn down the brightness on this guy a little bit. So again, if you ask yourself, oh, I want to keep it the same, I just want to make it a little bit darker, right? Well, how can we do that? We can add a color node, brightness and contrast, but we could also do something like hue and saturation or gamma even. All right, for right now, we'll just try brightness and contrast and see how that works. And we'll turn down the brightness. Now we're ending up with a lot more blue than we want. In fact, I've kind of decided now that steel, the original steel texture we're using, is just blue by default, but I don't really like that. I kind of want it to just be perfectly gray. So instead, what we'll do is we'll just take it out of the chain. We'll just take it out. We'll add an input RGB node right here in its place. And instead, we can make it something dark like this. All right? Now, Shift Z. There we go. I like the way that looks. Maybe a little bit lighter. That's not bad. Right? Now finally, let's add something to the text. Let's see. What would be a good contrast with the text? I'm thinking something, pretty much white would be the way to go. But let's make it a little glossy. So Shift A, shader, glossy, Shift A, shader, mix shader. Mix those two together. Right now they're still on perfectly white, so let's just keep it that way. And let's crank down the glossy a little bit, because we're on white, so like the gloss is like a real heavy kind of effect. Yeah, let's try cranking it up a little bit. It doesn't look bad. Doesn't look bad. Let's add the other one, material 03 that we just made, so it matches. Now I know what you're thinking. The text doesn't look very good because it's kind of like real sharp. We can try to do something about that real quick with a modifier, specifically the Bevel Modifier. Now you can see I just added it, and it's caused some problems. Remember I mentioned in the last video that the geometry on the faces is kind of real messed up sometimes. Well, this is a perfect example of when that causes problems. But if you go back, you can see that where it doesn't get messed up, it does add a little bit of a good roundness and whatnot. But we're going to take this back off. The other thing you can do to kind of create some fake roundness is to use a smooth setting, which in Blender, it's kind of weird to describe what it actually does, but it's kind of just a different way for it to interpret a surface. So right now, by default, objects are usually shaded flat. And so when you go into the render view, it's perfectly flat. But you can also change that to smooth. And then it kind of does this thing where it kind of interprets the surface as being smooth in a different way. And again, because of the geometry, you can see that like kind of like tiger striping and stuff there. It doesn't really work out. So, you know, if we really wanted to fix this, if you wanted to make this a workable kind of emblem and make it a little bit more fancy, what you would have to do is basically go into the edit mode and clean this up in here. You would have to get rid of all these faces and kind of make these, just kind of decrease the number of faces on here. All right, but we're not going to do that because that's going to eat up a bunch of time. So what we're going to do now is just kind of set up a final render. Okay, and we're going to do that by centering this light. So let's move the light to our cursor because our cursor is still in the center. So selection to cursor, G, Z. Okay, let's create a backing for this. Let's just make a white plane. Make it real big like that. And, you know, we'll just create a new diffuse modifier so we can control the kind of reflection of that if we wanted to. Now, let's create a camera. Okay, camera, G, Z. And then you notice that the camera's kind of a weird rotation. I don't know why Blender does that by default, but I just go in and change that to 0. Now, we haven't really talked about the camera controls at all yet. So in order to look through the camera, you hit 0 on your numpad. And right now it's defaulting to the camera that I have hidden at the beginning, which I forgot about. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that camera. Now this is the default camera. So when I hit 0, it comes over right over here. And I hit Shift Z again to look at the render view, and this is what I get. And you know what? This isn't half bad. We can change this a little bit by selecting that lamp or I should say this lamp, and moving it around. You know, maybe if we move it up here, and then we can adjust those lamp properties over here. We can make it bigger or smaller. We can make it brighter. How exactly do we make it brighter? I actually don't know. The way that I typically make light sources in Cycles is there was a time when the lamps straight up didn't work for Cycles, and so I actually never learned how to use these very much. What I actually do in Cycles to create light sources is kind of create them, dare I say, realistically. So what you would do is create a plane, and I would move it up here like this. Let's just get rid of that point light source for right now. New material, let's call it light 1, and then make it an emission material, and then let's crank up the strength, let's say 10. Now, if I go to my camera, Shift Z, I end up like this, and you can see in the 3D viewport, this plane is now my light, and I can crank up the strength of it. I can scale it if I wanted to. I can make it smaller or bigger, and this has an effect on the lighting of my scene, and it's a really good way to have very granular control over the lighting. So it's kind of the way I prefer to light my scenes. So that's basically it. Now that we've created this emblem, this is a very basic emblem, you could definitely make some improvements on here. You can make a border around the outside. You could make this curve more curved. You could soften the edges, maybe add some bevels in there. But for now, this is basically the extent of our tutorial here. When we want to render our scene, I'm just going to quickly go over some of these settings here. If we click on the little camera over here, what will happen when we render our scene with this button right here is it'll use this camera, or in whatever view the camera is in, and it'll use these settings. So right now I have the resolution set for 1920 by 1080 at 50% scaling. So when it actually renders this, the image will be 50% of 1920 by 1080. So let's crank that up to 100%. The biggest thing for new people that are new to cycles in Blender is down here at the sampling tab. Right now, the render samples are set at default of 128. In terms of cycle samples, that's not a lot. So remember I talked about the static and the graininess of the image there at the beginning? Like every time I move my mouse, you can see it gets real grainy. That's because Cycles is running multiple samples. You can see at the very top of the screen, that's the samples that it's running. When it starts at like one sample, it's very noisy, but as it gets up to 32, it gets a lot cleaner. So basically, the way the sampling works is the more samples you have, the cleaner that image is for Cycles. So when you do your final render, it's a good idea to have that as high as you can possibly stand, essentially. Because the more samples you have, the longer it's going to take to render. But the clearer it becomes. So I think of 1,000 samples as the right way to do it. I would only go lower than 1,000 if I was pressed for time, or if it simply wasn't necessary. Now this is a very simple scene, so really we could probably get away with something as low as 500 samples. Which, again, 500 is very low. You might not want to start at that because you might think that that's the image will look bad. But let's try 500, and let's just hit render and see what happens. So now you can see what's happening is, since I've set the computer, I've told Blender to use my GPU. I'm only getting one square that's just moving across the image and rendering the final image. If I was using CPU rendering, I would have multiple squares because CPUs typically have multiple cores, and they would be each individually moving across on their own. And the balance between there, it's kind of a little too much detail for you right now, but a lot of times GPUs are just plain better at rendering images in 3D lighting than CPUs. So CPUs might have a lot of cores, but GPUs will have one core, but they'll be a lot faster. So you make a trade-off, you know. It depends on what your CPU is. It depends on what your GPU is. But anyway, that's basically it. That's the tutorial. In fact, you know, just to have a nice little image to finish on here, let's drop these samples down a lot. Let's make it 100. And let's see what it looks like at 100 samples. 100 samples should go pretty quick. There we go. It's definitely a lot faster. So, that's it, guys. Thank you for watching my tutorial on emblem and logo creation in Blender. We've covered, in these 4 videos, we've covered a lot of pretty significant things here. Part 1 hopefully taught you the basic navigation of Blender and the basic object mode manipulation. Part 2 hopefully taught you edit mode and mesh creation, how to actually change those vertices to create custom objects. Part 3 was advanced modeling. We learned how to mess with some modifiers. Now, again, there's a lot more modifiers out there than just curve and array, but those are the kind of things that are the most useful for someone making an emblem and creating those kinds of procedural things. And then finally, in this section, we talked about UV mapping, material creation, and rendering in Cycles. The end result is that we have a pretty cool looking 3D logo right here, you know, for not a lot of time invested, maybe 1 or 2 hours of watching these videos and testing some stuff out. We've managed to create a very cool little custom logo, and from this point on, using this knowledge, you can create almost anything you want in a custom logo on Blender. So, again, I hope you enjoyed it, guys. I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.